Greetings, class and friends. Hey, boos. We're continuing to talk about this concept of African Black psychology. And today we're going to address concepts of African versus non Africentric models of African psychological functioning and assessment. I actually find this chapter interesting because it requires us to understand why personality and theories of personality are so important and significant in Eurocentric psychology, but we really want to be able to contextualize it in the context of African Black psychology. So first, in Eurocentric psychology, we should be familiar with all of the theorists who talk about these different stages of development and how a person develops impacts their personality. In African cosmology, individuals' personality per se, or they develop into who they are based on being connected to their cultural identity. And depending on the region, maybe their Ori or their Sunsum, they connect to their identity. But in African cosmology, African people want to develop into a whole person. So African worldview teaches us that African people are spiritual, collective. And so the personality that develops from this being that is spiritual, that is collective, family oriented, at one in harmony with nature, ends up being an individual who would not identify themselves as an individual but a part of a collective, but also want to develop into a whole person or a full person. And whole person development means that you have done all of the things that you were supposed to do in the various different stages and development in your life, and you have progressed through these different age cycles or age grade developments to become a whole person. A whole person means that you are trusting of your identity but also connected to your lineage. We talk about, I think Ani talks about a forward, Murabani talks about a forward and a backward connection. So in this chapter, we're going to do first, in the first mini-series, a quick analysis of Eurocentric models and how European people have historically viewed African personality. We're then, in the second unit, going to look at Africentric and non Africentric models of African personality as it relates to psychological function and assessment. Remember what I said about this notion of personality development, because the personality development is just an integral part. So when we look at traditional Eurocentric or European-centered psychology, the approach to the African personality has historically been very negative, pejorative. It has held a tradition of distortions, a tradition of misconceptions and misinterpretations of African psychological functioning. Now, we can connect that to the overdiagnosis of African people with schizophrenia, and misdiagnosis because of a misinterpretation of the African spirit. But we also can connect it to not understanding the culture and the traditions of Africa. But most importantly, which we'll talk about, I think, in the second unit, we can talk about the Eurocentric norms and standards of behavior, and these Eurocentric norms being considered the mark of what behavior should be, and African people in any deviation from this Eurocentric norm being considered abnormal. So European American psychology interprets African behavior in terms of a deviation from the Eurocentric standard or European norm. And the pictures are supposed to represent that. So if you deviate from the natural hair or your natural skin color, then that is supposed to be challenged with how we see ourselves. We'll break this down. We'll revisit this picture a little bit later. Okay, so Eurocentric psychology or European-centered psychology approach to the African personality. It is very important to note that the traditional Eurocentric psychological approach to African personality is centered on Eurocentric or European American cultural standards or norms. So what that means is that if you try to understand the African personality based on a Eurocentric or European worldview or European perspective in European psychology, you would attempt to understand who African people are and how an African individual's personality develops based on Eurocentric American cultural standards and norms. And that is basically based on European domination and control. So, Eurocentric models of African personality have historically been pejorative, very negative, and only viewed the experiential history of enslavement as key in the development of the African personality. And what that means simply is that the African personality, based on how European people interpret who African people are, is limited to the idea of the African, quote unquote, coming from or being a quote unquote slave. So the personality develops from this deviation from being a slave. So it is, in their interpretation, oppression oriented, and it projects a view of the African personality as being essentially the net result of complex forces of things such as racial oppression and inferior genetic condition, rather than arising from an independent, indigenous, culturally affirmative force or African cultural based forces. So in this unit, we're going to take a look at, in the next unit, what is normal, natural, no, that'll be the next chapter. What's normal, natural functioning for African people? So remember, we have to understand what psychology, or how psychology looks at African people right now from the Eurocentric models or Eurocentric standards. And then we'll go in to interpret that so we can better analyze what African Black psychology has, taken a position that is more correct orientation for African people. So we'll pick up in the next unit and we'll talk about these two classifications of African personality theories. So back in the day, not too far back, it says in the 90s, Black psychologists began to take a look at how African personality traits, African personality or Black personality perspectives were being analyzed. And they found that the analysis of the Black personality came from Eurocentric perspectives, Eurocentric theories. So then the goal is to understand how these theories analyze African people. Is it from an oppression-oriented, pejorative or negative perspective, or does it take a look at the African personality separate from European or Eurocentric theoretical perspective and look at it from an African perspective? So two theorists we're going to break down in the next unit, Azebo and Cambon or Baldwin, contributed to understanding of African personality theorists. Azebo looked at both African theorists and European theorists from a negative or positive motivational perspective. And Cambon looked at that as well, but he included the component or the analysis of worldview. So this concludes our first mini lecture, and we'll pick up with this in the next mini lecture. I forgot to say, Dr. Slater Sarah. Peace. Baboos.